Well, welcome everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to this event hosted at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Peter Lowen. I'm the Associate Director for Global Engagement and a professor at the Munk School in the Department of Political Science. And it's my real pleasure to welcome you here today for this event on the future of foreign investment in Canada. I want to start out, as we rightfully do, by acknowledging the land we live and work on has for centuries been the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we're fortunate and thankful to be able to live and work and play on this land even today. Today's event is really going to tackle some very central questions for the future of Canada, where the Canadian economy fits in the global economy, how changing economic realities and fundamentals are challenging the existing legislative and regulatory frameworks that we use to shape trade and foreign investment, and how we can make changes to those to make our country better ready to compete and make Canadian firms better ready to compete in a global marketplace in the balance of the 21st century. We've got three unique, important voices on this topic today. I'm going to introduce them, and then I'm going to ask them to make remarks in turn, and then we'll have a conversation moderated by our senior fellow, Graham Moffat, who's a wonderful both neuroscientist and commenter on innovation policy in Canada. I'll remind you that if you want to ask questions, we have a Q&A function where you can put questions into the Q&A box, and Graham will collect those up and collate some of them and put them to our panelists. Let me introduce to you briefly our panelists. They don't need introduction, but it is custom that we do it. The first is Jim Balsillie, who of course is the retired chairman and co-CEO of RIM, Research in Motion, and is presently the chair of the Council of Canadian Innovators, working tirelessly to update the regulatory framework and the legislative framework in Canada to get us ready to compete in the 21st century. Our second panelist is Susan Hutton, who's a partner at Stikeman Elliott, working in the Competition and Foreign Investment Group, and brings a unique, I think, very expert sightline into what we're talking about today. And our third guest is our own Dan Bresnitz, professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and the recent author of a book, Innovation in Real Places, available not only on his bookshelf behind you, but at fine bookstores everywhere, and through multiple online retailers. And I strongly recommend that you get the book. It's a real distillation of Dan's deep wisdom on this. I'm not going to say any more, except that I really appreciate everyone joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim Balsillie. Jim, welcome to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy.
Good afternoon, everyone. And first, let me say thanks to Peter and Graham for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion on the timely and important topic of foreign direct investment. And congratulations to Danny for such a successful book launch. May your insights wake up Ottawa sooner rather than later. My presentation materials to support my opening remarks are detailed, so they're on the website if of interest. The accelerated pace of innovation and the digital transformation over the past 30 years has created a new kind of economy in which the basis of wealth and power is derived from the ownership of valuable IP and control of data. Concurrently, the new technologies in this era, centered on the nexus of automated decision-making and machine learning, are reshaping our social and political spaces. Intangible assets comprise over 91% of the S&P 500's 28 trillion total value. This shift is unprecedented in its degree and rapidity, particularly with the emergence of high-profit firms with monopoly positions based on IP rights and control of data assets. In this economy, spillovers from foreign investment don't yield the same positive spillovers to the host economy the way they used to. This slide lays out some categories where spillovers from a traditional economy differ from an innovation economy, requiring us to reevaluate acceptable foreign investment models to protect companies and critical technologies that allow the wealth and security effects to benefit Canada. In the tangible economy, virtually all foreign investments, direct and portfolio, result in positive economic spillovers. But in the intangible economy, FDI takes the form of a business in one country possessing controlling ownership over what is commonly known as a foreign branch plant in another, which manifests as a negative spillover. In March, the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology released a report on their study of the Investment Canada Act that included recommendations for my testimony to improve the treatment of intangible assets under the net benefit review process. Canada's policies for foreign industry partnerships inside taxpayer-funded universities have long been out of step. In the traditional economy, foreign manufacturing plants enable local supply chains and provide management expertise, leaving positive economic spillovers in host cities. However, in the knowledge-based economy, local talent produces IP for the funder, and that intangible asset is then moved to corporate headquarters where it is commercialized and taxed. This slide demonstrates just a few of the partnerships that have contributed to low and declining outcomes for the Canadian economy. With IP exfiltration occurring at our publicly funded institutions across a number of strategic fields and technologies, none are of greater concern to our economy and security than the myriad of university partnerships with Huawei. Canada's orthodoxy over the past several decades has been unique in its extreme neoliberal approach to economic drivers such as labor, capital, and markets. However, Richard Harris, the economist for the Macdonald Commission, wrote in his report over 30 years ago that economic liberalization must be paired with an industrial innovation strategy to prevent a low growth, low productivity equilibrium. Our policy leaders ignored this advice. This was compounded by Canada's 15-year extended pub crawl of free trade agreements, even though such agreements focused on the constraints of regulatory frameworks for intangible assets rather than about reducing tariffs. As early as the 1990s, trade agreements became the main tool for devising preferential marketplace frameworks that suit the owners of IP. Today's trade agreements are called economic partnerships because they create expanded legal structures that enhance the value of those who own intangible assets by locking in the frameworks for foreign investment. Canada has yet to retool its trade strategies to reflect these economic realities. The knowledge-based and data-driven economies are not a continuation of the traditional production-based economy. Foundationally different in structure, the intangible economies feature unprecedented economies of scale, scope, network externalities, and information asymmetries. Utilizing highly centralized executive structures, a company's objective has turned to generating as much IP and data assets as possible and deploying those assets to extract economic rents. Critically, those two types of intangible assets can be scaled globally with near zero marginal production costs, which results in winner-take-all economics. The dominant effect of FDI in the innovation sector is not to create new jobs, but to repatriate top IP, data, and talent in a host country and reduce Canada to what Canadian economist Dan Chiriak calls the mediocre middle. Countries around the world have retooled and recalibrated their prosperity strategies to fit the shift from the traditional economy to the economy of intangibles. For example, Australia's legislation allows for any research agreement to be invalidated with no appeal or review if deemed potentially adverse. The UK created a screening regimen for foreign investment that protects both national firms and considers security, particularly in strategic technology sectors, which many countries are now identifying as part of a broader investment and security strategies. Canada's prevailing policy orthodoxy has been to stick with traditional production economy strategies for growth. This approach is rooted in misguided and counterproductive advice from high-ranking policymakers and industry leaders, as demonstrated on this slide. The consequences of this capacity gap for the contemporary economy have undermined Canada and will continue to have negative consequences on our prosperity and security if not adequately addressed. The good news is that we can fix this by adopting adequate policy levers that enable us to strategically secure our investments, by building capacity inside of our civil service, and by developing education for current and future generations of entrepreneurs. We will be well on the way to a prosperous, secure, and sovereign Canada. Thank you, and I look forward to unpacking this during our discussion.
Thanks very much, Peter, for inviting me to join this illustrious panel speaking on the future of foreign investment in Canada. And thank you, Jim, for raising these important topics for debate. My perspective is that of a practitioner, a legal practitioner who's been guiding proposed investments by non-Canadians through the net benefit and national security review processes for the past almost 30 years now. And from that perspective, I think we need to be very mindful of institutional expertise and capacities when we're asking for more government regulation. I just wanted to remind our audience of the common catchphrase used in association with the foreign investment review regime of the 1970s, and it was that you have nothing to fear but FIRA itself. That regime was seen to be choking under its own weight by the time it was replaced in the mid-1980s by the Investment Canada Act. And the former statute had required foreign investors to basically prove that they would be of benefit to Canada. And although a lot of the language remained similar, the attitude of those who were administering the Investment Canada Act was very much, let's just assume investment's good and really only hold up to scrutiny and review and undertakings of very few transactions. There's no question in my mind that the Investment Canada Act does reflect a focus on the bricks and mortar manufacturing economy, not an innovation or an intellectual property-based focus. That's reflected in the factors under the net benefit test. They don't really they don't exclude considerations related to IP, but the focus is on jobs, capital expenditures, exports, more traditionally associated with a manufacturing economy. And in addition, the only investments that are required to be notified or reviewed under the traditional scope of the Investment Canada Act, and I'll leave aside national security for the moment, are change of control transactions. So if you have a licensing agreement, for example, that doesn't involve the divestment of assets or employees, you're not even subject to the Investment Canada Act under its traditional net benefit analysis. That, of course, the scope of transactions and investments by foreigners that can be reviewed on national security grounds under the Investment Canada Act for the past decade and more is greater. Than you don't require a change in control, but you still require some form of investment. So again, a licensing transaction likely isn't caught if it's just confined to that. But before, my pitch today is that before we say we need to amend the Investment Canada Act to include licensing transactions, let's really be careful to make sure that we have the best institutional capacity and expertise so that this system and the expansion doesn't choke under its own weight. We have to ask if they have relevant expertise to assess what's a strategically important innovation and who should have access to that. I would point out that the IRD, the Investment Review Division within what used to be called Industry Canada, it's really just a handful of people, and they basically have to reach out to subject matter experts in other provincial or federal departments. And when it comes to national security reviews, they're essentially go-betweens between the security agencies and the investor. So I think it's also important to note that all notified transactions, all of these change of control transactions that are being notified currently to the IRD, they're all subject to a preliminary national security screen. So there's a misconception out there, I think, that somehow Canada's asleep at the switch when it comes to national security. Every single one is going through a national security screen that then Canada's national security apparatus, they get to say which ones are subject to a formal review. But the timelines for national security reviews and for any net benefit review, they're already typically maxed out. The personnel at IRD and many government agencies are already sort of working full tilt. So we have to think long and hard before we add a significant chunk of work to their plate. Do they have the institutional resources necessary? And I wanted to consider whether there are others with experience and expertise in the federal government who might potentially have more of this expertise and capacity. The Controlled Goods Program, for example, it's administered by Public Services and Procurement Canada. And already technologies with defense production applications are subject to the Controlled Goods Program. Similarly, the export control list is administered by GAC, Global Affairs Canada, and they're already used to dealing with military or dual use technologies with a view to determining whether foreigners should have access to that technology. My colleagues who deal with controlled goods program and the export permits tell me that both of these agencies are already pretty much maxed out with their current funding and personnel. So if we want to restrict the licensing of Canadian developed IP to foreign entities, we need to consider a very targeted approach, in my view, and really identify what's the harm that we're trying to address. And then, do we have the institutional capacity to deal with that? If all we do is tell IRD, oh, now you're going to have to review all of the licensing of intellectual property by every Canadian business to a foreign investor, they're going to drown under the weight of that. I'm concerned. So I think we need a targeted approach. I do think there are things that should be addressed. Even if we don't expand the scope of the Investment Canada Act, I feel that we can take a leaf from the books being written by some of our major trading partners. Australia, France, Germany have recently taken steps to identify what they consider to be critical infrastructure. That's as yet undefined. There were some guidelines issued over 10 years ago in draft form that were never formally adopted. But what even the pandemic has added to the list of what people think is strategically important. Now that would include food security and supply chains. And Australia has recently taken steps to formally expand the definition of critical infrastructure. And I think it would be very helpful to the investment community if we were to have increased certainty into what the Canadian government considers to be encompassed by the term critical infrastructure. So I think that the need for national security to be protected is very real. I think the Canadian government does pay attention to it, but we have to recognize that whatever changes we make to the Investment Canada Act, since it's an act of very broad application, will, if it's overbroad, will necessarily also scare off investment that we do want. So we need to make it very targeted. We need to think if it's really the best tool to address it. Maybe it's an expansion of the export control list, for example. And I think with that would be my key concern with any change, is that you sort of need to be careful what you wish for.
Susan, that's a fantastic opening, and I have so many questions that I've already written down that I can't wait to ask in our panel. I hope that the audience is also preparing some questions, and we'll continue to monitor the Q&A, see what comes up. And I would like to now hand it over to Dan Bresnitz to open his introduction.
Sure. So it's a pleasure being here with all of you. And it's a pleasure also to be with Jim, because we constantly change position. So if last time we did the webinar, I accused him of being too optimistic. And now I find myself being optimistic in the panel. And the reason I find myself optimistic in the panel is, I think, because I have lower expectations. And here is what I'll say. I think the real questions when you think about foreign direct investment or about economic development and innovation is, why do you want to have it? And the reason we usually want to have it, and especially innovation, is because it's the only key for sustained growth. And what is clear now is that key for sustained growth with IP is being strategically utilized by companies and siphoned away from locales with the line. So the question is really very clear in my mind, is what do we want foreign companies to do in Canada? How do we maximize the positive spillovers and minimize the negative spillovers? Because right now we are on the extreme negative spillovers. So two things. A, and that's why I'm optimistic. We're coming to Canada because we actually innovate amazingly. The fact that we as a country don't know how to write enough patents and put them in technology, global technology standards, and create our own companies, it's our problems. But the multinationals have realized that Canadian minds are amazing and they utilize them. So what I would want is for the multinationals to ensure or that as much as we have from the fruits of Canadian IP stays in Canada with positive spillovers, and that the people that learn from the multinationals how to do that stay in Canada and then open companies. And I think if we do that, we can do and deal with what Susan have just said. We don't necessarily need to start this very negative sets of you're allowed, you're not allowed, it's very difficult, can you come here, can you cannot? No, we can set rules. If your IP was sponsored by the Canadian government, you have to register it in Canada. B, when you registered in Canada, if you want to move the locale of the IP, you have to pay fines. That's just one example, has been utilized many times. The greatest example of utilizing this is by the Israelis. And by the way, it should also apply for Canadian companies that get a huge amount of tax benefits and then decide that they want to move to London without naming names. It just happened 2 weeks ago. That's one. The second, and I think one thing that I would highly recommend Canadian policy makers in the Ministry of Finance, Global for Canada, and all the rest to read is BEPS, B-E-P-S, Base Erosion Profit Sharing. Canada, by the way, signed that agreement as an OECD agreement. In that OECD agreement, it actually gives you pathways that tells you that the place where the R&D is happening is a place where you should register the R&D and pay taxes on said IP, no matter whether it's a foreign company or a local company that does it. So if Apple or Google or Huawei come to Canada and they do R&D in Canada, that leads to IP. That IP has to be registered in Canada, and taxes on the profits on that IP have to be paid in Canada. Why is this important? It's because the IP stays in Canada. We, taxpayers, get a lot of money, but more importantly, once companies do that and start to pay those kinds of taxes in Canada, they also tend to employ other people and not just R&D engineers, which is actually part of a reason we want FDI. We want good jobs for all Canadians. And that's a key policy areas that I have not heard a word about in Canada. So I'm very optimistic. We now have the tools to do that. It's not rocket science. We actually do not need, and I completely agree with Susan, we do not need to create more work for agencies that are already overworked. Instead, we have to establish a few certain rules about how IP needs to be created and registered, who pays for it, and what are the fines in case you do not do that. That's, of course, for anything which is not something which is so critically attached to security that either Canada or our dear friends in the Five Eyes tell us that we should not give it to foreign companies. That's beside that. Everything else, I think it's quite simple, quite optimistic, not a rocket science, but please, somebody in Ottawa, just do it.
What a fantastic opening. Thank you, Dan. So I'm actually going to direct my first question to you, Dan, and that is, in your book, you identify 3 different scales and types of innovation, some of which have created tremendous prosperity among a great number of people, some of which have created or have perhaps driven inequality in some places. That occupy different parts of the intellectual property and the production value chains. Could you outline where Canada sits, where we should aim to sit, and how we can best drive growth and innovation and maybe to the point of the difference between invention and innovation in Canada through policy?
Sure. So one thing that I said that in that, to answer your question, I wouldn't answer it for all of Canada. I think that we keep forgetting that Canada is huge. We might not have that many people, but it's huge and unbelievably diverse. And that's actually a strength when you talk about innovation, because you can experiment in different places. You can work on different stages, as you said, of innovation. And then if something happens, it's constantly happened in a global system, other parts of Canada, right? We are one big community, excel while some takes a hit. It's a portfolio, and that's how we should think about it. What's good for Alberta, Ontario, and Newfoundland are not necessarily the same thing. And I haven't yet mentioned all other provinces. Now, if you think about what happened in globalization, I have a phone, which I will not mention who owns it because all phones look the same. It is now produced all around the world. The hardware innovation happens in Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, Seoul, Taipei. Its components come from all over the place being produced. Then I use it because it has an app store and the software is. So we're talking about even in semiconductors, just the physical things. I can talk about places. So Silicon Valley that no longer have silicon, but who cares? Tel Aviv, Seoul, Taipei, Shenzhen, and each one of them have a really successful semiconductor industry. They all are involved in producing the same product, but what they do is different stages, right? Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv comes with ideas to put on silicon. Taiwan actually knows how to make those silicons. Korea excels in specific niches, and China now excels in making them all into working products. Please be aware that while Silicon Valley might have massive amount of profits, the American administration, even the Trump administration, actually had to beg a Taiwanese company, Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, to open facilities in the US because American companies have lost that innovative capacity and the jobs that comes with it. So the way to think about it is look at the idea as they come from your mind and how they slowly transfer to products in different stages, and then how they're being improved, okay? And those are the 4 stages. What Canada has been doing, unfortunately, and that was the branch plant, was very, very low, okay? Almost the end of innovation, but really without innovation to stick it in Canada, apart from a few unbelievable companies. We have the founder of, or co-founder of one of them with us. What Canada is now trying to do is to figure out where it's staged. I would say that different areas in Canada should aim to be Taiwan or Germany, while some areas might want to be Tel Aviv, but hopefully slightly less unequal. The problem that I have is that every city I visit in Canada claims it's Silicon Valley of the North or Silicon Valley of whatever, and that's not the way it should be. What Southern Ontario should do with its car manufacturing, what Alberta should do with its energy, what Newfoundland should do with its offshore are completely different from each other.
Great answer. I'd like to move to one of the audience questions now, if I could, to talk, and I'll open this up to the whole panel. I had this question actually written down, and it's been brought up by one of our audience members. So yesterday or the day before, the major Alberta universities were instructed to wind down and to declare all of their research partnerships with any Chinese institution affiliated with the government or the military of China. So the question we have from the audience is that, do you suspect that this is an inflection point that could be leveraged into a sounder policy framework? I'd like to make it more general, and I'll put a caveat in here. Stephanie Carvin, who's a thinker on national security, warned against taking ham-fisted approaches, whole of government ham-fisted approaches to reducing partnerships between Canadian institutions, Canadian companies, and potential rivals in other countries. How should we think about this moment, and how should we try to take advantage of this moment of sudden awakening to the realities of the new international economy and great power rivalry in terms of our policy framework? So I'll let whoever would like to go first.
Susan?
By all means, Jim, you're up.
Well, I would just say that in terms of how should we think about this, I think we have to recognize that Canada is subject to a great number of trade agreements, and that suddenly discriminating against investors and partners from one country in particular could get us in hot water under those trade agreements. And I also think that I just sort of hearkening back to something Dan said about, if you have government funding of certain research and you want to attach terms and conditions to the government funding, that seems like a more direct and targeted and more easily managed approach than sort of broad whole of economy prescriptions. And it seems to me that what we're talking about is it's been talked about since I've started paying attention to Canadian public policy. The kids in the schoolyard used to roam around saying, hey, get out of my way. I just came back from the USA. And this was like terrible for my parents to listen to. So we've been moaning and groaning about our branch plant economy and how to have positive spillovers from foreign investment since as long as I can remember. And I think that if we need to pay attention to the details of the partnerships, and if we want to attach upfront conditions to them, we should be transparent and really think about it, and before we start sort of issuing blanket decrees. That would be my reaction to that.
Hey, and my jump in on this would be that I think the China situation, that Huawei is an opportunity, because we have not, as Danny talked about, we have not managed spillovers, and the spillovers in the intangibles economy are profoundly different from the tangibles economy, because in the tangibles economy, a branch plant brings with it technology and management. In the intangible economy, it exfiltrates technology and management. So in fact, it's about understanding the spillovers. And the orthodoxy in Canada's policy community throughout this last 25 years has been any kind of investment is good. And when in fact it was much more nuanced. And as I showed you in my presentation, and Susan mentioned, different countries have different ways of analyzing this thing. We just put our head in the sand from a policy point of view. So what China does is, because these technologies have attributes that are now called dual use, and this is a very active part of the management, that you now introduce the security aspect of it, and you just can't put your head in the sand on China for the security elements of these things. But we have to understand that in a context of great power rivalries, in the traditional production economy, comparative advantage is a tide that rises all boats. Whereas in the intangibles economy, it's fundamentally a zero-sum mercantilist game, where one wants to be the landlord and the other wants to be the tenant. So if it wakes us up on the security spillovers to then start looking at the economic spillovers and then saying, well, wait a second, our policies writ large for our universities in these technologies have not looked at the broad set of spillovers, economic and security, because the structure's changed, then I agree. This is a catalyst to actually have people update their frameworks. They should have been updated 25 years ago, but the old expression, best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, second best time is now.
Great answers from both of you. So we have a question from an audience member that some of you might recognize as a major policy contributor on this, Dan Churiak. And his question addresses one of the issues in the world of superstar firms being strategic behavior that takes out potential future competitors. This seems to be a much bigger problem in the intangible economy than in tangible sectors. And the Investment Canada Act review kicks in at high thresholds of current value, not future value, and it's not obvious that competition authorities really get involved at all. He asks if this doesn't constitute a policy hole. I'd add one thing to that. I would ask that in your response, you suggest potentially heuristics or a framework for developing the right kind of investment review policy. That what are the things we should look for to trigger a review of foreign direct investment or a takeover, if it's not necessarily just outright scale at the time of acquisition? What are the things we should be looking at?
So maybe I'll just, at the risk of being repetitious, jump in first again. But my other hat, so the one I probably spend even more time on, is competition and merger review. And the world's competition merger review authorities are struggling with this idea of potential future competition, and when is a merger likely to prevent competition as opposed to lessening it. And they're waking up, some would say a little late. People point to various examples, Facebook's acquisition of Instagram, for example, as a case of, it sort of buying up its most likely future competitor at an early stage, and it flying under the radar screen. I think the authorities are therefore focusing a little bit more now within the framework of competition merger review on the acquisition of potential future competitors. What they struggle with, of course, is that like any business, how do you identify in advance the ones that are going to win? We know Instagram, in hindsight, you can tell it was a winner, but did they necessarily know that, or were they just going around and buying up lots of potential future competitors with the hopes of keeping their platform alive? My daughter, very much a Gen Zer, will tell you Facebook's dead, in her view, and her cohort is massively staying away from it. So is the government ever going to be better at picking a winner than the businesses, or are they even going to be as good at picking a winner? I think they need to try, and they are perhaps belatedly trying to do that. So it's very much a focus of competition merger review right now. In terms of Investment Canada review, again, IRD is a handful of people. They're not subject matter experts. They have to reach out to other experts and rely on other experts. I'm not sure that you're going to get a better kind of analysis by flowing that through the Investment Canada Act if the competition authorities of the world are already grappled with the issue.
So let me add to that, and that is two things. One of the reasons why we are in such a mess is that the strategic use of IP and IPR, and it's not just patents. So in the book that you mentioned, I have the last 3 chapters that are sort of appendices, and I say you need, as a local, right, the mayor of Hamilton, if you will, or the mayor of Calgary, you should know a lot about them, but don't assume you can change it, because even the president of the United States cannot. One is data, which we haven't talked about. The other is IP. And it is dysfunctional. And it's not dysfunctional for the people that make a lot of money of it, but for humanity that created IPR in order to solve a dilemma of how you incentivize innovation and increase diffusion. Various strategies of using patents, family of patents, adding trademark, copyrights, and all the rest are now making IPR into a tool in which you make monopolies. And you basically decrease the rate of innovation in areas that you care about very, very effectively. And I think that that's what we should care about. So the question is how you can be cynical around it. And what can a country like Canada, with all due respect, I don't think that our policymakers are going to be as good as the United States if the United States ever decide to go back into heavy antitrust, figuring out which companies to break and whether we even have a power. But what we can do is to ensure that when a takeovers happen of Canadian companies with IP, which again was sponsored by Canadian taxpayers, there is a clause that either the price goes unbelievably high, or other Canadian innovators have access to the use of those IPs at either nominal or no fees. That's one approach that I will do. I basically view this as a cynical game in which you have to assume asymmetrics of power, and you are the little mouse trying to fight the lion, so use your brain.
Yeah, I
So
think that's
to that point, before Jim,
one quick
Yeah.
thing to answer Dan. I wouldn't call it a policy gap. I would call it a policy canyon. And and we have to also look at the elements of Section 230 that were infused in the USMCA. So they get strategic behavior in the lobbying, in our M&A, our trade agreements, and we have woefully outdated competition rules and privacy rules. I think the one thing Canada should revisit, we took this extreme neoliberalism, which was a mistake, and Canada was built through strategic institutions, and we have to start thinking of strategic institutions for data trust, for patent collectives, things like the Gaia cloud in Europe, digital identity, and so on. So this idea that domestic institutions are somehow bad and extreme neoliberalism has, over the past 30 years, has served the country very poorly, and I think we have to revisit that. Anyway, I just wanted to jump in and to complement, to build off of what Susan and Dan said.
So a question I'd like to ask the panel that derives from two audience questions, one related to the Trade Commissioner service, and one that sort of generalizes out from there. So Canada seems to be a bit schizophrenic on foreign investment. On the one hand, we have branches of different governments, different levels of government, actively recruiting foreign investment and in all kinds of different forms, perhaps not the optimal way. And on the other hand, we have this now, we have a foreign investment review, and now we're going to try and, potentially reform foreign rules around foreign investment. What does a good or an ideal foreign investment look like? How do we get this balance to get the kinds of foreign investment we want? And what does that look like? What is an investor who shows up and we all can agree, or at least most of us can agree, that this is to the net benefit of Canada, that this investor either acquires or invests in Canadian technology or R&D or production?
Well, it's pretty rare, but the nature of the game is you got to give. And so in a sense, our orientation should be in the accumulation game and being the landlord as much as possible. And in a sense, to be the landlord, you've got to let people sometimes make you the tenant. So, but everyone aspires to be but we've self-tenant ourselves. And so I think the whole point of it is, let's look at the context, which is to be the asset the accumulator. And then, as Dan said, use sophisticated mechanisms. So if these people are going to come in some way, that you very deliberately manage the spillovers with a sophisticated, updated analytical framework, which has been AWOL for the past 30 years.
Let me become much more concrete. And let's go to Newfoundland. I know you heard about that province. And let's look about oil. And the reason I mentioned Newfoundland is because of Atlantic Accord. They actually did something really, really smart. And they said that if you invest in oil production in Newfoundland, you have to invest in R&D in the province to the average level of R&D globally. So you have to give back, as Jim said. And you can then you can immediately see which of those companies fought against it, which of those companies have done it, and which of those companies not only have done that, but work with the Newfoundland government to figure out a strategy that will constantly upgrade Newfoundland. And the reason I use Newfoundland is because when offshore oil was first found there, Newfoundland really did not have a lot of the capabilities to do anything about it, and basically no observative capacity. Look at Newfoundland today, and I think it's one of the most forward-looking, innovation-based province that we have now. I don't know how many of you know, but the biggest Canadian fintech unicorn has just been sold to NASDAQ for cash. Came out from Newfoundland on a technology based actually originally on mining. So if you look at those companies and you had the right government framework to engage with them, you can see which of them, one, let's say, very American, not really wanting to give back, and others which are more Asian and more state-owned or more Norwegian, that actually have become a partner with the local community. Of course, they want more profit than usual, but with the local community, thinking about how to develop them. So a question for me would be, how do you create those very long-term partnerships? How, if you want to move to high tech, you create a partnership with Intel and National Semiconductors, if anyone remember that company, or Motorola had with Israel, versus the relationship that some of those companies had in Ireland, which was go, get some tax incentives, say goodbye, and fire everybody, right? And this is what I would again urge Ottawa, but more of the provinces to start thinking about.
Susan,
Yeah,
we've talked a fair bit about what the correct policies should be, but you raised a critical point that the capacity to implement policy is already stretched beyond what our limited policy prescribes, or what today's policy prescribes. And we are imagining a more robust policy apparatus and a more robust implementation of these new forward-looking policies. What should Canada do, and what steps should we take to build that capacity for supporting review of foreign investment, for getting the policy right, for getting the implementation right? Canada has a very relatively robust policy apparatus, and we often fall down on implementation. Where should we invest, and what should we change in order to improve our performance?
well, I guess just picking up on something Dan was just saying about how, Newfoundland said, if you want to come in and take my natural resources, we're going to attach some terms and conditions to that will require you to focus on our economy. That's not a regulatory approach. It's very targeted. It's not putting in place, trying to imagine in advance the details of every nuanced investment that you need. That prescriptive sort of one size fits all, these are the rules, which you see reflected in Section 20 of the Investment Canada Act. These are the criteria by which we will assess the net benefit to Canada of all investments, right? You're not going to get that kind of nuanced approach with economy-wide framework legislation like the Competition Act, like the Investment Canada Act. To my mind, if you start going down into the grassroots level of investment, we're already funding a lot of R&D, a lot of it at Canadian universities, looking, as I understand from Dan, the Israelis did, on what are the terms and conditions that should be attached to government funding. How do we encourage people, like we encourage them in Newfoundland, to really work with the local business community to identify additional investments that will help that economy? There's everybody knows Alberta's economy is sort of boom bust tied to the oil patch, and people have been, again, talking for decades, how do we diversify, how do we get out of that trap in Alberta? And it seems to me it's a more targeted approach that's needed, not sort of a blanket, almost like a Soviet style decree, you will be better at innovating. I'm not sure we're going to get much bang for the buck with that.
So I think if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're advocating is another layer of investment review where the provinces now step in and put additional requirements on top of an acquisition or an investment?
No, that is not what I'm advocating at all. At all. I think I'm advocating a more innovative approach on the part of government to encouraging innovation. And I think we should look at what's been successful, if we have, and how can we try to replicate that in other provinces and other sectors in opposition to another layer of process and bureaucracy that will probably get us nowhere.
Great answer. Thank you. Jim, one of the ideas that's been suggested as a way of retaining and protecting Canadian companies and giving advantage to domestic champions in a world of IPR has been ideas like an asset collective. Could you describe how an asset collective might interact with new foreign investment rules and how it would interact with acquisitions and foreign investments in Canada?
Sure. I mean, throughout history, countries have created IP collectives. When the telcos were government owned, those were effectively sovereign patent pools. France and South Korea have several of them, Japan. And if you actually look at the largest patent filers in the world, an overwhelming number of them are Chinese state entities that are fundamentally creating IP pools. So really, it's less of an FDI play and more of if you get in the way of our companies, we have some armaments to make it much more painful for you to bother. The net benefit of bothering us goes way, way down. And anyone who's done global business knows that this happens all day, every day. They're darkening your door. Very substantial Canadian companies have had to sign permanent capitulation of their freedom to operate in both in addressable markets and in their margin to large companies that capture them at that vulnerable moment. So it simply, turns it into a standoff where you have a cross license or you leave each other alone. It's just to protect your companies as they go globally.
Does this encourage investment into these companies? Does it make it easier for them to raise capital?
Sure. I mean, if you have a better addressable market with a more supportive, and this is what, I mean, you look at Fraunhofer, everyone talks about Fraunhofer in Germany. They have 72 research institutes with, I think, 29,000 employees. They have one centralized patent agglomerator licensing contracting agency. Ontario's, I chaired a panel on this, is a fraction of the size. We have roughly 30 publicly funded tech transfer offices. So this has to be incredibly strategic, high skills, very coordinated, and it's precisely to say you have freedom to pursue market opportunities relatively unencumbered, which naturally means that you're going to prosper better, which naturally makes you more interesting for investors. We do a thing called Government Investment in Research and Development, GIRD, and they say GIRD leads to BIRD. But what they don't understand is the freedom to operate that leads to BIRD. So if you've got the freedom to operate, then people say, I will invest in you. Whether the government spent billions on universities and it's all gone to foreign companies, how does that create a context for domestic investment, for people wanting to invest in them? So yes, freedom to operate creates a more favorable opportunity for your companies to prosper, which means they're more favorable to be invested in.
So I'd like to open up the floor to each of you, if you have any questions for each other, to that opportunity now. And after that, we'll return to some of the audience questions. Does anyone want to challenge anyone else's point so far? Are we all in agreement?
I think
okay.
The one thing that I would like to say with Susan and Dan, which is, I don't think we're looking, the problem with the intangibles economy is it moves non-linearly. In the tangible economy, if you get it 90% right, you get 90% of the benefits. In the intangible economy, if you get it 90% right, you get 10% the benefits. So perhaps the conversation, would be to the leakiness of IP and intangible assets, and how it just requires such completeness in approaches, and thus it's not a blunt instrument, it's a series of things working together. And I'd like to ask Susan and Dan, would they respond to that kind of assertion? Do you disagree or agree with it? And what complementary things do we need to do to think about alongside the Investment Canada Act?
Susan, I think I've talked a lot, so I'll give you first option.
I was just going to say the same thing to you, Dan. I haven't really spent any time thinking about the leakiness of IP and the issue you raised, Jim. I think it's an important issue. It's another way of saying, how can, I'm thinking here of some of the work that former Deputy Minister of Industry did, John Nubley, on superclusters, and how do you encourage and avoid create a community and all of the different externalities and all of the different synergies that encourage innovation and encourage investment at the same time. If we could crack that nut, if I had the secret sauce, I would bottle it. Absolutely. But I'm still working on that.
So yep.
Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
No, I would say that I think in this case, again, I'm much more optimistic. And the reason is I don't think we've been in the game at all. The game of IP and thinking strategically about it. So I am very willing for us to start, and then it will be an experiment whether if you get it, 50% right, do you get something out of it, or do you really have to go 100% because it's more leaky? Right now, I think we're doing such a bad job that I wouldn't even think about the perfect. I just want us to start. And I think that even if we do just little, we can have some impact. And that's where I might disagree with you, Jim. I'll be delighted with 3 simple acts to begin. I think that if that's what happened after this panel, I'll be over the moon. If we ever come up with a perfect solution, I'll be impressed, but even I can't think about what the perfect solution is right now. I can just think about how to start.
So, question for the panel, and this is an open one. The Munk School is not just the Munk School of Public Policy, it's also the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. We've talked a lot about domestic policy related to foreign investment. We had an audience question about rules in the international order and how complex this has gotten. In the last 2 or 3 days, just this past week, we've seen a major challenge to Canadian softwood exports and another major challenge to Canadian dairy production and dairy quotas and rules for something that some of us might have thought would have been settled in the USMCA when we traded away many of the things we were asking for on IP and intangibles in favor of dairy quotas. Famously, at a previous Munk event a couple of years ago, the lead Mexican negotiator on the USMCA, when I asked him, what was Mexico's approach on intellectual property and intangible assets, said, I wish we had time to prepare for that. We brought a knife to a gunfight. So what are the international considerations? How should Canada's approach to international agreements change to reflect this new attitude or a better policy on foreign investment and foreign trade?
Well, I think the issue for Canada, the old expression I've seen, the enemy and the enemy is us. And we rushed, and I said in one of my slides, we rushed into all these trade agreements thinking they're about trade, but they in fact were about economic partnerships for IP maximalism when we're in an IP deficit. So we were supporting the landlords raising the rent as a tenant. And then we kept saying, well, can't we get multilateral agreements? Not understanding that the WTO was created fundamentally to do two things besides managing disputes. Lowering tariffs in a most favored nation and treating investors foreign the same as you would domestic, so national treatment. But what happens is the US pushed higher IP into that, which is TRIPS, maximalism, and it doesn't really fit. And then the problem is data doesn't fit anymore too, because it's not a comparative advantage rising tide structure. So these are fundamentally rivalrous or neo-mercantilist systems, the intangibles, as opposed to cooperative in the tangibles. So we've created a push me, pull you. And then in data, it also represents norms and security. Whereas, you take the banking system, everyone wants a stable banking system. So that's a shared global objective. So it's going to be messy on the global stage. And, all roads go to Canada upping its game and standing up for itself more. No one put the boots to us more than the US under USMCA and Europe under CETA. So our best friends raise the rent on us as the tenant. And we have to understand, I think, and I'm deeply involved in these issues in Europe and in Washington. I think the world's going to get messier before it gets easier. And what you're seeing between the US and China is all about marketplace frameworks for these intangibles. That's the core element of the dispute, but that's the core element of the dispute between the US and EU right now. So yeah, what used to be good for us to be in this protection shield, we need to up our game for this new global realities and kind of look for different alliances and different structures, but most importantly, raise our game and understand which way is up. And this is not like it was 40 years ago. This has changed over the last 20 years, but we doubled down on it when the game changed in the 90s, thinking it was still the 70s. And we've paid a sorry price in Canada.
I wish I could disagree with you, Jim, but I would agree. We need to realize that nobody's going to take care of Canadian interests if it's not Canada. The fact that our trading partners are our largest trading partners, we cannot trust that they will take care of our interests. They're not going to. They never were going to. And to the extent that we ever were naive, we need to stop. We need to stand up for ourselves.
Dan, anything to add?
Yeah, I would add that even when we have the tools to help ourselves, like BEPS, base erosion profit sharing, which actually should help Canada because we do a lot of R&D but gain nothing out of it. We are not even aware that we signed the agreement. So what can I do?
Is this a tool that we can potentially use to our advantage, this base erosion profit sharing? And has the government used it effectively at all in the past?
The government, as I said, doesn't seem to be aware that it exists, so they have not used it at all. Base erosion profit sharing happens not because people love Canada, but partly because the US got really, excuse my language, pissed off on its own companies like Apple and Google not paying any taxes on the R&D they did, but channeling it through a non-existent place somewhere between Holland, the Netherlands, and Ireland, if you remember the double Irish-Dutch sandwich, which allow them to pay taxes. And what base erosion profit sharing does is trying to put the taxation and trading framework that you had in the past on a world where most of the profits and the taxes are on intangibles. And it basically says where you have activity, i.e. R&D, is where you have to register your IP and where you should pay taxes on them. So if Canada now has more and more R&D centers or foreign multinational corporation, if we follow BEPS and follow it correctly, they should pay more taxes here, a lot more taxes, because IP are immense profits making. Once we do that, it's much more, it's easier. I wouldn't say much more easier, because nothing seems to be easier for Canada to convince them to also have other activities in Canada, because they already are paying taxes here. So once you pay taxes in a locale, it's no longer a locale you use in order to siphon things from. You pay taxes, that's a rate. Okay, so everything below that rate, and also other kind of activities, I'll gladly move there. I just have to do it. We should use it. We should at least read the agreement we signed upon, all agreements. This time it's actually a good agreement for us, unlike all the other trade agreements that we signed off. But we're not even doing that. So I just don't know what to say, because it's becoming obvious that even when we have tools, we just don't use them.
So to follow on that point, you know, some of the work done by members of the Innovation Policy Lab, Dan Monroe and I think Craig Lamb produced a report recently that showed a much more rapidly increasing investment by foreign firms in R&D in the information and communication technology sectors in Canada than domestic firms. It seemed certainly not to show crowding in, and you know, maybe not quite crowding out yet, but certainly no crowding in. What are the risks? What are the lessons that Israel learned about becoming too dependent on foreign MNEs using the R&D workforce and accessing this highly skilled workforce and spillovers and effects on inequality?
So in the case of Israel, what happened is that you should think about multinational R&D centers like startup on drugs, meaning they really employ only your R&D engineers. So what happens if the only thing that the multinational does in Canada or in Israel is just the R&D, then it takes the people, the graduate of the best universities in engineering, so not exactly the people you should worry about, and give them very, very high wages, while the rest of the economy doesn't get that much apart from their income taxes, and no other jobs are created, which is exactly, and that's increasing inequality. So when you have 2 or 3, who cares? When you have over 300 employing 40 to 50% of all your STEM labor force, and especially the top end, because they can offer wages that are up to triple what the local companies can do, then you start to have a problem. And you can solve it in 2 ways. One, which Israel is quite good at, but the balance started to shift, is to create your own companies and hope that they create jobs for the rest of the economy and more profits. The second is to either limit the number of multinationals, which is very difficult to do, but to engage with those multinationals with both carrots and sticks, so they can do, they do more things in your country, let's say Canada, and hopefully also, you know, pay taxes would be a nice start, just because the taxes then gives the government the ability to do something. And I would, so the way to think about it, and the way I think a positive way to think about what both Canada and the province should now do when they think about the multinationals coming, especially to do R&D, is think about it. This is a long-term relationship. It's a marriage. How do I make sure that both sides get a happy marriage? Okay. Instead of thinking, okay, I can now have a title, 150 new jobs created in Ontario, ching, ching, let's move on to the next. No, it's a very long-term relationship. Let's make sure that this marriage works.
Susan.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and it goes back to encouraging. You know, we've got government funding for research, and are those dollars resulting in the creation of great new ideas that are just, you know, flowing out of the country without any implementation here? And how can we work with the investors, not you know, labeling them as bad, but if they want to come to Canada, and then great, how are we going to work together for the benefit of the Canadian economy, and just having the gumption to be frank about what we're doing. We're standing up for the Canadian economy. That's what we're doing. And so how can we work together to do that? Other countries around the world have done it. Countries that are smaller than us. And I've never understood our sort of Boy Scout mentality and not wanting to offend anybody. Other countries much smaller than us have no trouble offending people. And I think we should be less deferential.
How do we roll out a new regulatory framework, a new investment review framework, without making your job impossible? So a company comes to Canada, wants to make an acquisition. They work with your team at Stikeman. How do we make this streamlined and effective so that we don't get bogged down in terminal reviews or different layers of government?
I think what I've not been somebody out there advocating reforming the Investment Canada Act and expanding its role. To my mind, you need a more targeted sector by sector approach. One size does not fit all. So I actually would not make my job as a foreign investment review lawyer any more difficult. I think you're going to get much better results if you go down to that grassroots level and have the government working with the industry, as they have in Newfoundland, to say, how can we work together in this specific project, in this specific town or industry, or with this particular technology? How can we encourage you to invest in more than just the patent? How can we encourage that investment? So it's not a question of command and control from the top regulation. It's more of a grassroots approach that I would say, and that my job actually wouldn't be affected in the slightest. I would get no more business. It would be great for my business if I were to say, please expand the scope of all this foreign review, foreign investment review under the Investment Canada Act, and lower the thresholds back to where they were, and expand your meaning of national security hugely, and make that would increase my business. But I also would, why would I do that? I'm a Canadian, and I don't want to see the Canadian economy choke under the weight of too much regulation. To me, the government does its best work when it works with investors to say, okay, how can we encourage a win-win partnership here? And we've seen some recent examples of the announcement by some foreign pharmaceuticals that they're going to do, vaccine development here. And, that's the sort of work where I think we focus on positive spillovers, I think, Jim, as Jim would refer to it, and not this sort of one size fits all Soviet style regulation.
So we're now getting closer to the end of the broadcast. So I'd like to give everyone an opportunity to wrap up just briefly with a comment on, if we're successful in getting these policies right and this policy reform right, what would Canada look like in 5 years or 10 years? How would things work differently in terms of foreign investment in Canada? So maybe we'll go back to Jim and start where we started initially.
Well, I would encourage people to look at slide 8 that I presented today, and I know those are going to be up, because you have to understand our policy orthodoxy of our path to wealth was to put our jewels on the front lawn with a table and says, help yourself. So I think in the last decade, Canada's GDP per capita has diverged 35% with the US. They've gone up 35%, we've gone down 3%, so I guess that's 38%. And those are IMF numbers. So our world will look different on the outcomes because we'll be more prosperous, and we'll be able to afford the healthcare and all the things, social programs we want. I think where will manifest itself differently is the things that, Dan was saying, and Susan, that we won't trumpet our naivety. We'll know which way is up. We'll know which side our bread is buttered on. Just like you don't trumpet the fact that you leave your kids at home at night and go look, tutor the kids in another in another city while your children fail, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be charitable to the world, but you fundamentally, your responsibility is your children, your family. And so I think we've lost that sense of innate looking after ourselves in our policy community. I just encourage you to look at slide number 8 and just say, 5 years from now, you won't see that kind of garbage in the policy discourse. You'll actually see people saying, let's look after our country, our future, our security. And then all these things will have a natural orientation to them.
Dan, final word.
So let me be a little bit more controversial. So here is why I'm very worried about the Canadian economy. And I'm very worried about the Canadian economy, not because of a multinational corporation. I mean, I'm worried about them, but I don't think that's a real worry. My real worry is that I'm looking at business R&D, BARD, and I'm looking at total factor productivity or real productivity figures for Canadian business and the whole business sector for the last 20 years. And it is going down year by year, no matter which party is in control in Ottawa and what is the prime minister called. And we are now reached a level in which we are the worst in the OECD in terms of R&D intensity in the business sector. So it seems that we just don't know how to do innovation policy, and that our businesses are either stupid or evil, or if we just make profit. So what I would like to see, and we know that those multinational corporations that are actually coming to Canada really know how to do R&D and make money out of it. So what I would like to see is us engaging with them on a long-term prospect that might start to convince Canadian businesses to look at what the American and Chinese multinationals are doing in order to control the world and say, well, they're doing it with Canadians, so why can't we do the same thing?
Fantastic. Great response. Thank you. And the very last word to Susan.
I don't disagree with anything Jim and Dan have said. I do think that my hope is actually in one particular area. I do think we've referred to and we've touched on very briefly, and it could be another entire discussion, but data protection and privacy, I do think we're very sadly behind where we need to be. And for Canadians to control our own fate, we need to control our own data.
I want to take the chance to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us today, to Susan, to Jim, and to Dan, and to Graham for his very able hosting and moderation of this event. This is a real very complex and serious set of issues, and I really appreciate both the broad brushes with which we've painted the landscape today, but also the detailed policy work and knowledge that's been brought to the table here by all three of our participants. This is a big, challenging issue we're facing in Canada. It's happening across multiple dimensions with multiple pressures, internationally and domestically. We have to have many more conversations like this, I think, to solve this problem, but this has been a wonderful chance to put together people with respectful agreement and respectful disagreement on some things. And I've really appreciated the chance to really sit back and watch this. So thanks very much to all three of you. Thanks to our audience members. We will send out Jim's slides to everyone who's registered for the talk so they have a chance to see it. And I encourage you to visit the Munk School website to see other events that we have coming up. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.